Hi, I'm Dr. Susan Pierce Thompson, and I have a question for you. Why is it so hard to lose weight? I mean, really, have you thought about it? How can it be that in America alone, 108 million people are spending money each year on diet-related products and services? That's almost 50% of the adult population, and trying 4 or 5 new attempts each year, and yet still more than 2/3 of us are overweight or obese. Even more puzzling, so many people are accomplished in almost every other area of life. They're brilliant at their careers, they've gotten amazing educations, they're raising their families, they're successful at what they put their mind to, and yet when they put their mind to trying to lose weight, they're not successful. Or they lose weight and then they gain it right back. And a lot of them are incredibly educated about nutrition. Like, know a whole lot about what to eat and what not to eat. Know so much about it. Some of the most educated people about nutrition are struggling with their food. So what is it that's making us not able to be the author of our own destinies when it comes to the food that we put in our mouth? I can't wait to address these questions with you, and I have a lot to say on the subject. And where I want to start is with something I like to call the susceptibility scale. And if you haven't taken the quiz yet to figure out what your score is on the susceptibility scale, there's a link right on this page, so you can just wait until you watch the video, and after you watch the video, click the link and take the quiz for yourself. I think you're going to find it really helpful. Okay, so what is the susceptibility scale and why is it so important? So the susceptibility scale is a scale from 0 on the low end up to 10 on the high end. And it measures how much someone is affected, drawn in, overtaken by the addictive pull of refined foods. And people respond very differently to food depending on where they're at on this scale. So on the low end, you've got people who, when they start eating, all the way through the eating experience, they feel completely in control of how much they're eating. And as they eat more, they naturally get full, and that fullness is coincided with an immediate desire to stop eating, and they push their plate away and they're like, oh, that's enough, I don't want any more food. And they're not taken over in their life by thoughts of food or obsession with food, and they don't binge. And they may even forget about food for periods of time and only remember when their tummy growls and stuff that it's even time to eat. It's a very different experience than what people who are on the high end of the susceptibility scale go through. So if you're on the high end of the susceptibility scale, you start to eat and then frequently experience a lack of control over how much you eat. So your body might even be saying like, oh, that's a lot of food, but the mouth and the brain are still saying, no, I'm not done yet, I want more, I need something more. And there's profound cravings that go along with this and a feeling of being out of control and never being satisfied. And over time, thoughts of food and obsession with food and what you've eaten or not eaten and whether you're on your plan or off your plan or, all of those thoughts, what you weigh, what you don't weigh, whether you're being good with food or not good with food, all of that starts to take over and occupy a much bigger proportion of your life than feels right or sane or manageable. And in extreme cases, there might be patterns of really bad binging that go along with this. So what this means on a very deep level is that we are not all the same when it comes to food, and that the solution that leads one person to feeling happy, thin, and free is not going to be the same as the solution that leads another person to feeling happy, thin, and free. And I gotta tell you, I knew this deep down in my bones from a very young age, because I am a 10 on the susceptibility scale. And I was not overweight as a kid, but by the age of 12, I was overweight. And I started to become very aware of my body, and I started to diet. And what would happen for me is I would start a new diet or a healthy, scientifically based eating plan, And I would stick with it for a while, and I would start with such focus and intention. I would get a new journal, and I would write my weight and my height, and I would measure all kind, my neck and my arms and my bust and my waist and my hips. I don't know, I measured all these things. And I'd get it all down, and I'd write my goal weight, and I'd make resolutions, and I'd say affirmations, and I'd figure out my plan of what I was going to eat and not eat. And I would start with such focus. And then fast forward some months or maybe even weeks, just weeks later, there I would be as fat as ever or more so. And I could never figure out why the focus and energy that I put into other things in my life that allowed me to get 4.0s in school and run a marathon and achieve other things in my life wouldn't work when it came to my food and my weight. And I knew that there was something different about me. And by the age of 28, I was obese. And I didn't know I was obese. No one knocked on my door and presented a certificate or anything. I think actually a lot of people in America or other places who are obese, don't even know it, right? Or just walking around unaware. So I was obese. I know now because I know what I weighed and I can calculate it on the BMI chart. So there I was, 28 years old and obese, and a miracle happened for me. I ran into a friend of mine who I knew to struggle with food and her weight the way I did, and she was slender. And not just slender, her shoulders were back, her eyes were sparkly, and she seemed so peaceful and free and sane and radiant. And I asked her what she was doing, and she said she'd found a 12-step program for food addiction. And she told me about it, and it sounded pretty rigorous, but I gotta say, by that point, it didn't deter me because I knew that I needed rigorous. And I went to a meeting, I got a food plan, and the magic happened for me. I lost 60 pounds in 6 months. I shrank from a size 16 down to a size 4. I gotta tell you, when that happened for me, I felt like I was suddenly a 7-year-old girl who'd been told by Walt Disney himself that she got to be the princess and live in the huge castle in the Magic Kingdom. It was incredibly liberating to finally live in a right-sized body. It's been well over a decade now, and I'm still in a size 4. And I gotta tell you, I've learned now that actually places me in the top 1/100th of 1% of successful weight loss maintainers. Almost nobody loses their weight and keeps it off for over a decade. Here I was in my private life going through this transformation, and after I lost all my excess weight, I spent just about every spare moment of my time helping other people to get happy, thin, and free. And I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of people with their food and their eating and helped them to get down to goal weight. But I'm also a professor, and my background is that for most of my life I've been in academia, and I got tenure, I got promoted, professor of psychology, teaching a college course on the psychology of eating. And I started to experience a really weird Twilight Zone thing, because as an expert in the psychology and neuroscience of obesity and weight loss, I'd go to conferences where my colleagues and I would gather, and this one conference stands out in my mind. I want to tell you this little story. I was in Midtown Manhattan. We were all gathered in this beautiful conference center, and it's the last day of the conference. Not only is it the last day, but it's the last session and it's the last speaker. And this esteemed professor from Cornell University stands up to give a talk that, summarizes our experience there that weekend. And he leans down into the microphone and he says, "We don't know shit." And we all gasp. And then he says it again. He leans down again and says, "We don't know shit." And then he says, correction, "We know all about why people are getting fat. We know all about their insulin and their ghrelin and their night eating and their genetic disorders, but there is not, to this day, a single published scientific paper that demonstrates long-term sustainable weight loss in any cohort of people. Not one." And we all kind of sat there stunned because we knew it was true. And the National Weight Control Registry has been collecting data on people who've lost their weight and kept it off, and they keep having to lower their standards. To get into the registry today, you only have to lose 30 pounds and keep it off for a year, which means you could start at 300 pounds, lose down to 270 pounds, and be in the National Weight Control Registry. And they have a hard time finding people to join the registry because almost nobody is losing their weight and keeping it off long term. So I sat in that audience having a little bit of a Twilight Zone feeling because I knew how it was possible to take off all your excess weight and keep it off long term. I hadn't just done it myself, but I'd seen hundreds of people do it. And I did stand up in that conference and speak to that a little bit. And sometime after that, I did partner with one of those scientists and start to design a study. But I also had a realization, and this was in my morning meditation right around my 40th birthday. A feeling came to me deep in my soul that I needed to do more than just try to design research studies about this. I had to share a message now because people are suffering now. People are struggling with their eating, overweight in a body that's keeping them from fulfilling their true potential, feeling like they're putting off their lives until they lose the weight, not wanting to show up freely in the world because they're in pain and achy and tired and not feeling good in their skin, knowing that they're not living their right life. And that's exactly how I used to feel. And this message of an entirely new way to conceive of the problem of weight and obesity and eating and food has got to be shared. And I was reflecting a little bit on why it is that I came to piece together this scientific understanding of how it is that our brains are blocking our ability to lose weight. And I think the answer is that I was blessed with being able to start with the endpoint. The endpoint being a solution that works, right? I was shown, I didn't make it up. I'm not that smart. I didn't make it up. I was shown a way to lose all my excess weight and keep it off. And once I had that solution firmly in mind, once I knew what the endpoint looked like, I was blessed to have the academic training in both cognitive neuroscience and psychology to really piece together the science behind why it worked. And I realized this message has got to be shared. So what I've done is I've created a free video series, and you're watching it right now. This is the Food Freedom video series. I've put together 3 videos to share for fun and for free to tell people about the psychology and neuroscience of truly sustainable weight loss so that people can once again feel like they are the author of their own destinies when it comes to the food that they put in their mouth and the way it manifests on their body. So in this first video, for the rest of the video, I'm going to talk about 2 awful bugaboos that really plague people: insatiable hunger and overpowering cravings. And no matter where you're at on the susceptibility scale, this applies to you, because if you're on the high end, you get plagued by these especially strongly. On the medium end, they pull you in. And on the low end, you get to experience a little bit of an understanding of why it's so challenging for other people to moderate their intake of food from a neurobiological standpoint. So super helpful. In the second video, I'm going to talk about the one huge mistake that just about everybody makes when they try to lose weight. And this one mistake affects everybody. Doesn't matter where you're at on the susceptibility scale, but of course if you're higher on the susceptibility scale, it's going to pull you in even more strongly. So the second video is all about that one huge mistake and a very practical program of action for how to never make that mistake again. The third video includes information about the genetic and environmental roots of where you're at on the susceptibility scale, and then it talks about how your brain can completely rewire in 5 different ways to make losing weight easier and easier and easier, and something that you can stick with completely long term, forever. I wouldn't be doing this over 10 years later, well over a decade later, if it wasn't really, really easy by this point. So a lot of people try to change their eating in ways that makes it harder over time, like a rubber band that stretches so much and it just feels like it's got to snap. This isn't like that at all. So I'm going to cover that in the last video, how your brain will rewire for food freedom. Okay, so hunger and cravings. Let's talk about hunger first. And I'm not talking about the kind of hunger that you haven't eaten in 6 hours and your tummy's growling and you really are hungry and need to go get something to eat. I'm talking about insatiable hunger, the kind that doesn't get satisfied by eating a regular-sized meal. The kind of hunger that keeps people stuck to the couch for hours and hours and hours, eating more and more, finishing off a bag of something and then going to the cupboard or the freezer to get more food. What is up with that kind of hunger? And the answer is, it has to do with leptin. Do you know about leptin? If you don't know about leptin, you need to learn about leptin. Leptin is a hormone that tells your brain you're not hungry anymore and you want to get active. In evolutionary terms, it's the feedback mechanism that makes sense, right? That if someone is living in a land of plenty and the berry bushes are abundant and the nut trees are dropping nuts everywhere and you've just killed a wildebeest and you're stuffed and stuffed and stuffed day after day after day, you put on a little bit of fat and those fat cells release leptin. And the leptin circles back to the brain and says, you can stop eating now and go get active. Go use this energy to find a mate or build a hut or do something else to ensure your survival. So leptin is what kept our ancestors from getting fat, because every time they'd put on weight, they would stop feeling hungry and they would immediately want to go get active. So leptin was discovered in 1994 and it made scientists baffled because they said, well, wait a second, leptin is released by the fat cells, and so the fatter you are, the more leptin you have. Why isn't it working? And finally, in 2004, researchers at the University of California at San Francisco discovered that leptin is not working because it's being blocked in the brain. And what's blocking leptin in the brain? I'm not going to answer you for a second because I just want you to think about this deeply. The answer is the key to the entire obesity pandemic. When we solve the problem of leptin resistance, we have the answer to how everyone can get happy, thin, and free. You ready? The answer is insulin is blocking leptin at the brain. So what that means is, key takeaway, if you want to lose weight, you have to dramatically lower your insulin levels. Okay? So what raises insulin levels? Sugar and flour. Eating too much processed, refined foods. I'm not talking about just the insulin spike that happens when you eat a cookie. I'm talking about raising baseline levels of insulin to 2 and 3 times what they used to be in 1970 and 1960 when people were generally pretty slender. The baseline insulin levels of our entire population have been rising. We need to bring down insulin levels, and what raises insulin is sugar and flour. And for anyone who thinks that sitting on the couch and eating is a moral issue, I want to tell you a little bit about the mice in which they discovered leptin. So they discovered leptin by genetically engineering some mice to have no leptin at all. They didn't have the gene that produced leptin, so they had literally 0 leptin at all. And do you know what these mice did? They sat by the food trough and ate. And they wouldn't move. Ever. Mice usually run around the cage, right? They're like little frisky little creatures. These mice, they just sat there. They ate and they got fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. And the only way to make them move was to move the food trough to the other side of the cage, and then they would slowly waddle over there and sit down and eat more. Were those mice morally defective? Did they need to be like educated about how to eat less and exercise more? No, they didn't have any leptin in their brain. Their brain was saying, you're starving, you've got to conserve energy and eat. And until we bring down insulin levels so that leptin can get on board, we're just going to be sitting on the couch and eating. So that's hunger. Let's talk now about cravings. So, cravings. Cravings that drive you to get out of your house on a wintry night and drive to the convenience store to get a pint of just that perfect flavor. Cravings that lead you to abandon your plans for a healthy dinner after a long day and just decide, oh, let's order a pizza. Cravings that have you wandering up and down the grocery store aisles thinking, what's going to do it? I need a little something, right? Where do those food cravings come from? The answer is that they have to do with the addictive pathways in the brain, just like drugs of abuse, just like cocaine and heroin. When you take those drugs, release a big flood of dopamine into the nucleus accumbens and the addictive centers of the brain. The same happens when you eat those heavily processed, refined foods like sugar and flour, pasta, cake, cookies, ice cream, pizza, all those foods. They release a massive flood of dopamine into the addictive centers of the brain. And what the brain does, it's very savvy. It adapts very quickly. It says, whoa, that was excessive. We don't need that much dopamine right now. And it modifies the receptors, the dopamine receptors, and they thin out. The technical term is they downregulate. And what that means is you now are lacking the ability to feel pleasure unless you eat enough to get back to normal. You've got now to eat refined foods, otherwise you feel lifeless, scared, depressed, lack of energy, fearful. I can see it in people's eyes when I propose to them that they might want to stop eating sugar and flour. I can see the life drain out of their eyes, and they look as if life would be bleak without those foods. That's when I know their dopamine receptors have been downregulated. But I promise you, it goes away, because what happens is when you stop flooding the brain with dopamine, the receptors replenish and they grow back, and those cravings go away. So what I just proposed to you, I don't know if you caught this or not, was that sugar and flour affect the brain like heroin and cocaine. Did you catch that? I did say that, or at least I implied it, and I'm saying it now, and it is true. It's true scientifically, and it's also true if you look at how these substances are made. So yes, we have studies, a mountain of studies, that show with PET scans and fMRI scans that sugar and flour affect the brain just like heroin and cocaine. We also have developmental studies in rats where you take them as babies and then you start to feed them the foods of the standard American diet. You feed them cheesecake and sausage and all these foods, and they get fatter and fatter and fatter, and their dopamine receptors downregulate, and they become completely hooked, just like rats that are allowed to overindulge in cocaine and heroin. They'll even stand on an electrocuted floor and withstand electric shock to get their food. It's crazy. They look totally like addicted rats. So it is true in terms of addiction research, there is absolutely no difference between drugs of abuse and sugar and flour. But I want to propose to you that that isn't actually that surprising if you think deeply about what sugar and flour are. So let's think about where drugs of abuse come from. What is cocaine? What is it? Where does it come from? How do you get cocaine? Well, it comes from the coca leaf, right? So in Colombia, they chew these coca leaves, and they're pretty innocuous. You put them in your cheek and you chew them, and it doesn't do much for you. It gives maybe a lift like drinking half a cup of caffeinated tea. It's not a big deal. Nobody's like breaking into their grandma's house because they're chewing coca leaves. It's not happening. But you take the inner essence of those coca leaves and you purify it and refine it into a fine white powder, and now you have cocaine. You've taken a natural plant-based substance and made a drug. And what's heroin? Well, heroin comes from the poppy plant. Pretty harmless on its own, but if you take the inner essence and purify it and refine it into a fine brown powder, now you have heroin. And what's sugar? Well, you don't get sugar directly. You have to take the inner essence of some kind of plant substance, whether it's beet or corn or sugar cane, and you refine and purify it into a fine white powder, and now you have sugar. And what's flour? Well, you can get flour in lots of ways, right? You can take Any kind of grain, you can take wheat, of course, or oats, or rice, or barley, or rye, or soy. You can take any legume, pretty much any grain or legume, and purify it and refine it into a fine powder, and now you have flour. We have, through our processing methods, taken wholesome, real foods and turned them into drugs. And the susceptibility scale tells us that drugs do not affect everyone equally. And you might think that the addiction is in the drug. Like people say, oh, well, heroin's addictive. Anyone who does heroin enough will get addicted. Really? Are you sure about that? So all around the world, each year, lots of people have surgeries, and they go home with prescriptions essentially filled with heroin pills, right? Vicodin or whatever it is, opiates in those pills. They take those pills after that surgery, they get physically hooked on it, and when it's time to wean off, many people just wean off successfully. Were they physiologically hooked? Sure. Did they have a problem stopping? No. And some people can't stop taking the pills. Just like with alcohol. Is alcohol addictive? Sure. Do lots of people drink and have no problem? Sure. And some people drink and become alcoholic. So the susceptibility scale tells you, when it comes to food, how susceptible are you to the drug-like foods that have been introduced into our food supply, and how much have they hijacked your brain, and how much are they keeping you hooked? Now, some folks who are on the low end of the susceptibility scale at this point are thinking, I'm scot-free. And I just want to point out that drugs of abuse affect people who are not hooked all the time, because drugs of abuse have powerful reward salience for the brain. They're incentivizing for the brain, and they trick people into overconsumption even when they're not hooked. And that's why we actually find that something like 40% of the people in America who are obese are not high on the susceptibility scale. And 60 or 70% of the people who are overweight are not high on the susceptibility scale. Because these foods that act as drugs in our brain trick us into eating more of them than we wish we would eat. And so now we circle back around to the susceptibility scale and its value in understanding how potent of a solution we're going to need to, again, reclaim our power and become once again the author of our own destinies when it comes to our food. Because I got to tell you, after living a lot of my early years overweight and then obese, nothing feels as good as living now in a body that feels congruent with how I want to show up in the world, in a body that feels healthy, where I put on clothes at holiday time. I can put on a dress that's form-fitting and feel good in it. And if you are missing out on the feeling of showing up in the world in a body that feels right to you, I just want to tell you that there is a solution for you. There really is. So refined foods are addictive. And neurobiologically, it's totally true. Scientifically, it's clear. And I feel like people already know this. I mean, food addiction is talked about in the popular media. There's lots of books about it. But even esteemed experts on food addiction are making recommendations like, these foods are addictive, so only eat them once or twice a week. And I read that and I think to myself, they wouldn't say that to someone who is trying to quit smoking. So what's been missing from our public discourse about food these days is any deep or effective consideration about how different people, depending on where they are in the susceptibility scale, can best live and move in the obesogenic food environment that we live in. Because the reality is, it's not going anywhere, right? The big food companies are not about to change the foods that they're selling to us as long as we keep buying them. So in this video series, we're coming back to ourselves and our fork and our spoon, and how can we, day in and day out, eat in such a way that we feel like the author of our own destinies. Because when you crack that code and finally get happy, thin, and free, I gotta tell you, it's the best feeling on earth. So this is the end of the first video of the Food Freedom series. I'm so grateful you watched. We covered a lot of ground. We're going to cover even more in the next videos. Video 2 is all about the one huge mistake that everybody makes when they try to lose weight. And once you know about it, you won't make it anymore. I'm going to give you an action plan for never making that mistake again. Video 3 is how to get your brain to rewire for weight loss. For now, though, we've come to the end, and I would love it if you would scroll down and leave a comment. Would you do that for me, please? Now, there's a like button and a share button. Hit those. That would be awesome. Everybody likes a like. Everybody likes a share. But really, I want to hear from you. I want to hear from you. So scroll down, leave a comment. Tell me what your susceptibility score meant to you or what this information meant to you. And I will be reading those comments, commenting on as many of them as I can. And I can't wait to meet you down there in the comment section. And I can't wait to talk to you in the next video. Stay tuned.